London at night has two faces. On one side, the postcard city, black cabs, glowing theatres in the West End, the endless hum of a metropolis that never sleeps. But away from the bright lights, in estates scattered across Hackney, Tottenham, and Brixton, another London was being written. One painted not in neon, but in blood. By the late 2000s and into the 2010s, the city's underworld was changing. Cocaine and heroin were no longer just the business of seasoned criminals with connections abroad. They had filtered down into local gangs, fueling postcode wars that divided whole neighborhoods by nothing more than a street name. With drugs came money, and with money came violence. But the most chilling transformation wasn't who was fighting, it was how young they were. 16, 17, 18. Boys barely old enough to legally drive a car were carrying guns, machetes, and orders. In some cases, they weren't just gang foot soldiers, they were hired killers. Disposable, underestimated, and frighteningly effective. The idea of a teenage hitman sounds like something out of a film, but in London, it was a headline. Judges, detectives, and grieving families all struggled with the same disbelief. How could a child be capable of such cold-blooded murder? Yet case after case proved it wasn't fiction. These weren't isolated bursts of rage. They were calculated executions, sometimes carried out for just a few £1,000s, enough to buy designer clothes, a flashy watch, or a reputation that stretched far beyond their estate. And each killing tore through communities, leaving parents asking how a kid who once kicked a football in the park could become a contract killer by 17. This is the story of London's youngest assassins, children by age, but already bloodied by the streets. A world where innocence was traded for power, and where teenage boys became executioners long before they ever had a chance to become men. No child is born a killer. Before the mugshots and the trial dates, they were boys in school uniforms, chasing footballs on playgrounds, or joking around in corner shops. But somewhere along the way, the streets swallowed them whole. London's gangs learned a long time ago that youth was their most valuable weapon. Teenagers were invisible to suspicion. A 15-year-old on a bicycle didn't look like a threat until he was carrying a blade or a pistol tucked beneath his hoodie. Older criminals knew it, and they exploited it. Children became runners, delivering drugs for pocket money. Then came bigger tasks, hiding weapons, watching corners, carrying out beatings. By the time they turned 16, some of these boys had already been hardened, stripped of fear, and groomed to do the unthinkable. The price of a human life in this world was shockingly cheap, £2,000, sometimes even less, for a teenager living in an estate where opportunity felt like a myth. That kind of money wasn't just a temptation. It was a ticket. New trainers, designer jackets, the latest phone, status among peers, respect in a world where reputation meant survival. Real cases exposed how easy this slide into violence could be. In Croydon, 18-year-old gang members executed Danny Gough in 2010, a teenager himself, shot in broad daylight as part of a feud. In East London, other boys barely out of school became foot soldiers in postcode wars that left communities paralyzed with fear. Their names filled headlines briefly before vanishing into prison records. Psychologists would later testify in court. These kids weren't born monsters. They were desensitized, drawn in by older gangsters who treated them like pawns on a chessboard. Killers in training, raised in environments where violence wasn't just normal, it was currency. By the time a teenager agreed to pull a trigger or swing a blade for cash, the boy he once was had already been buried. What was left was someone colder, sharper, and terrifyingly willing to do the job of a grown man. In North London, the name Jermaine Richards, known on the streets as J-Man, became a chilling reminder of how young a killer could be. He was just 16 when he crossed a line that most grown men would never dare to. The story begins in the shadow of gang feuds that gripped London estates. Richards wasn't a mastermind. He wasn't a crime boss pulling strings from the top. He was a boy who had been swept into a culture of postcode wars, where grudges turned into funerals and respect was measured in blood. By 2007, he had already earned a reputation among his peers as someone who wouldn't hesitate to act. On the night of the murder, Richards carried a handgun that had passed through countless hands before it landed in his. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a test. He had been tasked to prove himself, to carry out an execution that would secure his place in the hierarchy of his gang. The target, a rival teenager caught in the wrong postcode. What followed was brutal and clinical. Richards fired, leaving his victim lifeless in the street. Witnesses later recalled the eerie calm with which the young assassin walked away. No panic, no hesitation. For detectives arriving at the scene, the details were horrifying enough, but the age of the gunman left even hardened officers shaken. The press wasted no time. Headlines branded him Britain's baby-faced assassin, a child who had traded innocence for infamy. His mugshot showed a boyish face, but behind it was a teenager who had carried out an adult's crime with chilling precision. In court, prosecutors painted him as a willing killer, someone who chose the path of violence, but others saw a different story. A child manipulated by older gang members, groomed into pulling a trigger before he even had a chance to grow up. Jermaine Richards was sentenced to life in prison, 16 years old, life behind bars. The weight of the sentence sent shockwaves through the country. For many, it was the clearest sign yet that London's streets had birthed a new phenomenon, the teenage hitman. In January 2019, London was jolted by one of the most shocking murders of the decade. Jaden Moody, just 14 years old, was riding a stolen moped through Leighton when a black Mercedes cut across his path. He fell to the ground, dazed and vulnerable. What happened next was caught on CCTV, and it would haunt Britain. 3 men leapt out of the car. One of them, wielding a machete nearly half his size, launched a savage attack. Within seconds, Jaden was stabbed 9 times, left to die in the street. The killer was Ayoub Majdouline, barely 18 years old. Majdouline wasn't just another reckless teenager caught up in gang feuds. He was carrying out what prosecutors later described as a contract-style hit, ordered by members of the Mully Boys, a notorious East London gang battling rivals over county lines drug turf. Jaden had been marked for death simply because of who he was associated with. The brutality of the killing stunned the country. This wasn't a random fight. It wasn't 2 kids clashing with knives. It was an execution, carried out with the kind of precision and ruthlessness that made it clear Majdouline knew exactly what he was doing. For this, he had been promised status, money, and respect. At trial, details emerged of Majdouline's life, a young man who had grown up in care, shuffled between foster homes, and eventually groomed into the orbit of dangerous older criminals. To the gang, he was disposable, a teenager they could push to the front line of their war. To the public, he became the face of a new horror, teenagers acting as hitmen in Britain's capital. Majdouline was sentenced to life, with a minimum of 21 years before parole. Jaden Moody's family never recovered. His mother spoke of her son as a beautiful soul, stolen in the most brutal way imaginable. The murder of Jaden Moody crystallized a truth London could no longer ignore. Children were being used as killers for hire, and in the drug wars tearing through the city, there was no age too young for bloodshed. What goes through the mind of a boy who agrees to take a life? In the courtroom, their faces often tell 2 different stories. On one side, you see the bravado, the smirk, the cold stare, the refusal to look at grieving families. On the other, when the doors close and the cameras disappear, some of these teenagers break down, their childlike fragility cracking through the tough mask they wear for the streets. Psychologists who studied these cases described a disturbing blend of factors. Many came from fractured homes, where violence, neglect, or instability were part of daily life. Others had been groomed by gangs from an early age, promised money, loyalty, and brotherhood. By the time they were handed a weapon, their sense of empathy had already been eroded. Killing wasn't seen as unthinkable, it was seen as business. Drill music and social media added another layer. On YouTube and Instagram, violence was glorified. Lyrics bragged about stabbings, and gang rivalries were broadcast for the world to see. For a teenager desperate for recognition, carrying out a hit didn't just buy loyalty within the gang, it could turn them into a legend online. Courtrooms became stages where this duality was exposed. Some killers, like Ayoub Majdouline, appeared emotionless as the brutality of their crimes was replayed. Others, when confronted with the reality of spending decades behind bars, crumbled into tears, the weight of what they had done finally sinking in. One detective described it best: "You're looking at a boy who should be worried about exams, but instead, he's calculating the quickest way to drive a blade into someone's chest." That chilling contradiction is what made these cases so haunting. Beneath the hoodie, behind the hardened stare, they were still children, but children who had been weaponized. And once they crossed that line, once they had pulled the trigger or swung the blade, there was no going back. They weren't just gang members anymore, they were killers. When the first headlines broke about teenagers carrying out execution-style murders, Britain was stunned. These weren't stories of hardened middle-aged gangsters. They were about boys still in their school years. Baby-faced assassins, the tabloids called them, plastering their mugshots across front pages. The public's reaction was a mix of disbelief, outrage, and fear. For the Metropolitan Police, it was a wake-up call. Units like Operation Trident, originally created to tackle gun crime in black communities, suddenly had to confront the reality that killers were getting younger and younger. Detectives described chasing leads that led not to seasoned criminals with decades of history, but to teenagers who still lived at home with their parents. It forced a rethink. Gang wars weren't just adult business anymore. Children had become the frontline soldiers. The murder of Jaden Moody in 2019 crystallized this national shock. His death, captured on CCTV and replayed endlessly on news channels, became a grim symbol of how London's streets had changed. Politicians stood up in Parliament, promising tougher crackdowns on knife crime. Communities in Leighton and beyond held candlelight vigils, desperate to reclaim their neighborhoods from the violence. But for every vigil, there was also silence. Families too afraid to speak out for fear of reprisals. The media fed the fire. Newspapers drew parallels to American gang wars, while TV documentaries painted London as a city spiraling into chaos. Headlines screamed about Britain's child hitmen, framing the issue as a national crisis. It wasn't just crime pages anymore, it was front-page news. But behind the sensationalism were real families living in fear, parents who refused to let their children walk to school alone, teachers who struggled to keep boys away from gangs that recruited right outside the school gates, communities torn between mourning victims and watching their own kids drift into the same cycle. The nation was forced to ask a difficult question. If teenagers were now carrying out professional killings, what did that say about the future of London streets? The courtroom is where the swagger usually ends. When teenage killers faced justice, the bravado that had carried them through the streets often melted under the weight of reality. Life sentences, prison gates, and decades stretching ahead before they'd even turn 40. Judges didn't mince their words. In case after case, sentences were handed down with grim finality. Jermaine Richards, 16 years old, was told he would serve life for pulling the trigger in cold blood. Ayoub Majdouline, 18, was given a minimum of 21 years for the Machete killing of Jaden Moody. The message was clear: age would not shield them. But prison didn't turn them into legends, it stripped them down. Inside, these young men discovered that the reputations they built on the outside meant little when faced with hardened inmates who had lived the life much longer. Some tried to keep up the mask of fearlessness. Others struggled, broken by isolation and the knowledge that their lives had effectively ended before they had really begun. Reports from prison officers painted contrasting pictures. A few of these teenagers still carried themselves with arrogance, convinced they were untouchable even behind bars. But many more showed the cracks, the panic attacks, the fights, the loneliness of being cut off from families who no longer visited. One officer described a teenage lifer crying in his cell at night, whispering that he never thought it would come to this. Their sentences also sparked fierce debate outside the walls. Was locking up teenagers for life truly justice? Or was it society's way of washing its hands of them? Critics argued that these boys were victims of grooming and poverty as much as perpetrators of violence. Others countered, whatever their backgrounds, they had made adult decisions, and their victims never got a second chance. For the families of the dead, the sentences brought some measure of closure, but never peace. Behind every mugshot was a victim who would never grow up, never get their future back. And behind every locked cell door was a teenager who had traded his own childhood for the fleeting respect of the streets. The murders carried out by London's teenage hitmen were not just crimes, they were warnings. Each one left behind more than a grieving family. It left a community scarred and a city forced to confront its own reflection. For many, the true shock was not only that children had been killed, but that children had become the killers. How had the capital reached a point where boys barely out of school were executioners? In the aftermath of cases like Jaden Moody's, charities pushed for early intervention. Youth clubs and mentoring schemes tried to reach boys before gangs could. Teachers were trained to spot the signs: sudden cash, new clothes, older friends outside school gates. But resources were thin, and the lure of the streets remained powerful. Police cracked down with stop and search campaigns and county lines raids. Yet critics argued enforcement alone could never solve it. For every teenager arrested, another seemed ready to step in. The media's role was complicated. Sensational headlines about Britain's child assassins shocked the nation, but in some circles, the coverage only fueled the myth, turning killers into legends instead of warnings. Behind the noise were the quiet truths: mothers burying sons, siblings growing up without brothers, and communities stuck in cycles of fear. The legacy of London's youngest hitmen isn't just about the crimes, it's about the questions they leave behind. Questions that still hang heavy over the city. How do you stop a child from becoming a killer? And once that line is crossed, is there ever a way back?